The morning they mapped her blood, Sarah Fella thought of her grandfather's hands. Not the hands she'd seen in the nursing home, papery and trembling over a cup of tea that had long gone cold, but the hands in the photograph she had memorized before the Keth came, before the satellites burned, before the word refugee stopped being historical and became the only word that mattered. In the photograph, Emir Fella stood in front of a white-walled building in Algiers, squinting against the sun, one arm raised as if he'd just been arguing a point and had not yet brought it down. His hands looked like they could break stones. They looked like they had already broken some. She thought of those hands as the extraction needle found her median cubital vein, and she made no sound. The technician was not a creature she had words for yet. The Keth catalogers had a designated subspecies for the procedure: long-limbed, translucent-skinned, eyes like oil on water. They didn't speak in any register a human ear could parse without the translators built into the processing collars. But this one's collar speaker rendered its directions in flat, gender-neutral English, which the Keth had apparently decided was the administrative language of the species it had just finished conquering. The irony would have made Sarah's mother furious. Sarah filed it away instead. Remain still. Genetic extraction is required for classification. Movement may corrupt the sample. She was still. She had been still for 3 days. Since they'd taken her at the Marseille transit point, along with 400 others, and loaded them onto the gray processing vessel that now sat in high orbit above a coast she could no longer see. She had been still the way stone is still. Everything in her had gone very quiet and very dense. The needle came out. A thin coil of her blood turned dark in the extraction tube. She watched it until they took it away. The holding bay smelled like copper and recycled air, and something underneath both of those things that she had decided to stop trying to identify. It held 600 humans in tiered bunks of 4, divided by a series of barriers into family groupings. The Keith did this, apparently, as a processing convenience. Families were cataloged together. The relational data formed part of the genetic record. Sarah was not in a family group. She'd been placed in a general cohort, which meant the Keth had found no registered relatives in their human census data. It was not an accident. Her mother, Caroline, was in the French civilian processing stream, separated by 3 decks and a bureaucracy Sarah had so far found impenetrable. Her brother Matteo had made it to the lion-safe corridors before the corridors stopped being safe, and she did not know where he was. Her sister Lilla had stopped responding to messages 6 weeks before Marseille. What the Keth did not know, because she had burned the records, physically burned them in a courier bag in an alley behind a bakery in the 13th arrondissement, was that Sarah also held Algerian citizenship. A passport she had spent 2 years fighting to obtain after her grandfather died. The Algerian citizenship databases were still partially offline, still in the chaos of the first contact collapse, which meant that in Keth records, Sarah Fella existed as a single data point: French, mixed heritage, unaffiliated. To the Keth, unaffiliated was a flag. Unclassified genetic profiles were held for secondary assessment. Secondary assessment, as far as Sarah could tell from 3 days of careful listening, was where they decided what to do with you. She sat on the edge of her bunk and watched the catalogers move through the bay. They moved the way all the Kith moved, with an unhurried certainty, as if they had never in the entire history of their civilization arrived somewhere to find that things had not gone as planned. They were catalogers in the deepest possible sense. They sorted, they compared, they assigned categories, and then presumably they filed people away. Her grandfather would have hated them. Emir Fella had been a man who resisted categorization with the full force of his personality, which was considerable. He had come to France in 1963 with a degree in civil engineering, a profound distrust of all administrative systems, and the conviction that a man who let someone else define him deserved whatever definition he got. He had spent 40 years building structures in a country that officially welcomed him and culturally did not, and he had never once let either of those facts be the whole of his story. He was Algerian, he was French, he was a communist, an atheist who prayed when he was frightened, a man who told his grandchildren stories about mountains he had not seen in decades with a specificity that made the mountains feel like something you'd visited in a dream. By the time Sarah was born, he was already old. By the time she was 12, he was old and difficult and occasionally transcendent. By the time he was dying, he was mostly gone into the fog of the dementia, speaking to people who weren't there, confusing decades. But sometimes, between one thing and another, he would surface and look at her with a complete and present attention, and say something that she would carry for years. The last thing he had said to her, really said, with his eyes fully on hers, was this: "You don't have to choose, but you have to know." She hadn't understood it then. She'd been too busy crying. They came for her on the fourth day. 2 catalogers and a security unit. The Keth used a heavier subspecies for enforcement, broader through the thorax, with a second pair of limbs that were not exactly arms and not exactly weapons, but were clearly capable of being either. She did not resist. She walked with them through corridors she was memorizing with every step: junction frequencies, pressure door cycles, the peculiar acoustic signature of load-bearing versus decorative walls, and into a room that was just a room, gray and lit and smelling of nothing at all. They sat her down. The intelligence that appeared on the far side of the table was not physical. It was a projected interface, something between a hologram and a direct neural display, shaped vaguely humanoid, because the Keth had learned that humans were more cooperative when they had something face-shaped to look at. It spoke through a translation system that was noticeably better than the cataloger's collars. More idiomatic, less flat. Sarah Mireille Fella, it said. Born Paris, France. 31 years of age. Registered occupation, geospatial analyst. No current relational classification. That's correct, she said. Your genetic extraction has returned an unusual profile. Something moved in the display. Patterns she couldn't read. Graphs in a visual language she didn't have. Human genetic classification in the standard Keth taxonomy runs along 17 primary vectors. Your profile registers anomalies across 4 of them. She kept her face still. I have mixed heritage, explain. My grandfather was Algerian. My grandmother was French-Algerian. She had Berber ancestry and Spanish ancestry, and probably some things no one in my family had a name for. My mother's family is French, with Corsican roots. My father's family is from Brittany. I took a genetic test before the invasion. She paused. It told me I was 41% North African, 37% broadly European, 9% unassigned, and a number of other small fractions that added up to a person. The display processed this in silence for a moment. This is consistent with the anomaly profile, it said. However, the standard human classification schema currently used for processing is European-centric, as the initial census data, provided by your former administrative governments, was built by Europeans, Sarah said flatly. Yes, I know. Another pause, longer. You are indicating that the classification system itself is flawed. I'm indicating that a classification system built on incomplete data will produce incomplete classifications, which seems like relevant information when you're deciding what to do with 600 million people. The display was very still. She had the impression, she could not have said why, of something recalibrating behind it. You are being processed under temporary unclassified status, it said. This does not mean I know what it means. She'd had time to work this out in the holding bay. It means I'm not assignable to a resettlement protocol. It means I get held while the parameters get reviewed. It means I'm expensive. She looked directly at the face-shaped light. I'd like to propose an alternative. The silence that followed lasted long enough that she counted 11 of her own heartbeats. Proceed, it said. She had spent the last year before the invasion on a project that had nothing to do with geospatial analysis. It had started with the album. After Emir died, she'd gone through his things with the careful attention of someone who believed that objects held information that people failed to transmit in words. She'd found photographs, letters, documents, the residue of a life that had moved between countries and languages and political configurations, accreting meaning at each border, crossing the way ships accrete barnacles. She'd had it all digitized. She'd added her own notes. She'd hired someone to write the connecting narrative, the story of a family that was never one thing, never placeable on a single map. She'd built a record. What she'd also done, without meaning to, without seeing it as anything more than personal grief management, was become very good at understanding how identity data worked, how it was structured, stored, queried, how different administrative systems categorized the same human being in completely different ways, depending on which data fields they prioritized, how the same person could be French in one system, and Algerian in another, and Berber in a third, and not fully any of them in a fourth, and how, if you understood those structures deeply enough, you could move between them. The Keth genetic taxonomy was, at its core, a classification system, sophisticated alien, with 17 vectors instead of the crude national and ethnic categories humans used. But a classification system. It had parameters. It had edge cases. It had the same fundamental vulnerability all classification systems had. It assumed the things it was classifying were stable. "What I'm proposing," she said, "is that I help you fix it." The display interface considered her. "You are proposing to assist with Keth census operations. I'm proposing to identify the specific failure modes in your current human taxonomy. In exchange for access to the prisoner communications network, reclassification of myself as a technical specialist, and family reunification processing for 3 individuals." She kept her voice level. "Those are my terms." The display said nothing. "You have a problem," she said. "You've processed 42 million Europeans through the standard classification schema in the last 6 weeks. You're about to process the same schema across populations for whom it was not designed: North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, East Asia, the Americas. The misclassification rate in those populations is going to be catastrophic. You'll have resettlement conflicts. You'll have population cohorts that can't be assigned to any protocol. You'll have," she paused, let herself smile just slightly, the way her grandfather had when he was about to win an argument he'd been building for 20 minutes. "Exactly the kind of administrative chaos that makes an occupation expensive." Another long pause. "You are bargaining," the interface said. "I'm offering a transaction." She folded her hands on the table. "Steady. Those are different things." They gave her a workstation in a secondary analysis bay. They gave her color translation at conference quality. They gave her access to the census error logs, which was everything she'd actually wanted, because the error logs told you where the system strained. They did not give her the communications network. They did not give her family reunification processing. They gave her a Keith oversight technician, named in the translation something like Assessor 7 in the lineage of Pale calculations. She called it 7. 7 was not unfriendly. 7 was efficient and persistent, and had the quality of attention that Sarah associated with very good scientists. It looked at things fully, without the film of assumption that most beings draped over whatever they were examining. It watched her work with a focus that might have been intimidating if she hadn't spent her childhood being watched the same way by Emir, who had believed that close attention was the highest form of respect. She worked. She found errors, real errors, genuine ones, because the taxonomy really was badly calibrated for the population variance it was encountering. She filed reports. She flagged anomalies. She was by every observable metric useful. She was also by no observable metric done. It was her brother's voice that undid her. She'd been on the station for 11 days when she overheard it. Not him, just a recording. A 2-second clip in a communications log she'd been asked to cross-reference for classification data. His voice, saying her name in the particular way he said it when he was frightened, with an extra beat before the second syllable. Se, ra, like he was making sure it would land. She filed that clip correctly, flagged it accurately, and then excused herself to the sanitary facilities, and sat on the floor and did not eat for the next 18 hours. This was not a strategy. She knew, even while it was happening, that it was not a strategy. It was just what her body had decided to do. She lay on the bunk in the quarters they'd assigned her, and wore the technical uniform they'd issued her, and looked at the ceiling and felt the particular texture of grief that comes not from loss, but from distance. The grief of knowing that someone you love exists somewhere in the universe, and the universe is choosing not to let you find them. She had felt this before. After Emir died, she had gone weeks without eating properly, curled on her couch in her grandfather's old cardigan that smelled of him, watching documentaries about the Algerian War of Independence with the specific fervor of someone trying to convert grief into knowledge. She had taken the DNA test then, a commercial kit, a cotton swab, a small plastic tube, and waited for the results with a desperation she had not been able to explain to anyone around her. As if a percentage breakdown could tell her what she was. As if the code in her cells could answer questions the living had failed to answer. The result had told her, 41%. A number. A fraction of a human genome that corresponded to a geography she had visited twice in her life. And she had held that number and thought, this is not enough. This is not a self. This is a sample. Her grandfather had told her something different. You don't have to choose, but you have to know. She thought about that for a very long time, lying on the bunk. She thought about what knowing actually meant. Not the number, not the percentage, not the taxonomy, not the Keth's taxonomy, not the genetic test company's taxonomy, not the French administrative taxonomy, not any external systems assessment of what she contained. She thought about what she actually knew in the solid, immovable way her grandfather had meant the word. She knew her grandfather had put his hands flat on the dirt of a construction site in Lyon, and said a prayer in Arabic to a god he'd theoretically stopped believing in because the ground had taken 3 of his workers and he needed somewhere to put the grief. She knew her mother had thrown a shoe at her father in 1997 and broken a window, and then spent 4 hours putting the glass back together with an expression of total focus because she could not stand to leave a mess. She knew her sister could name every bird by its call and refused to explain how she'd learned it. She knew her brother said her name in 2 beats when he was scared. She knew that she was not a sample. She knew that she was not a percentage. She was the sum of everything that had been handed to her, deliberately or not, and everything she had chosen to carry, and everything she refused to put down even when it was heavy. She was the granddaughter of a man who had crossed the Mediterranean with a degree and a conviction and had built things that were still standing. That was not in the taxonomy. That was not in the 17 vectors. That was not something that could be extracted with a needle and rendered as a graph. She got up. She went back to work. 7 was waiting. You were absent from the analysis bay for 18 hours and 42 minutes, it said, with the particular tone the translation rendered as neutral concern. Not accusation, not warmth. Something in between that Sarah was starting to think was just what 7's face sounded like. I was. She sat down at the workstation and pulled up the census error logs. I found something before I left. I want to walk you through it. 7 positioned itself across from her, watching. Full attention. Your 17-vector taxonomy, she said, is designed around the assumption that genetic variance correlates predictably with administrative and cultural classification. The Europeans who built your initial census data believed, on some level, that ancestry and identity were roughly the same thing, that if you knew what was in someone's genome, you knew what category to put them in. The assumption is a reasonable prior, 7 said. It's a reasonable prior for a species that spent most of its history in small, isolated populations, she said. It is not a reasonable prior for a species that has been moving across its planet for 200,000 years, trading and migrating and intermarrying and colonizing and being colonized. Human genetic variance is extremely high compared to most species you've likely cataloged. And human identity is not a function of genetic variance at all. It's a function of, she paused, searching for the right word, accumulation. What you carry, what you choose to carry. 7 was very still. What is the practical implication, it said carefully, for the classification schema? The practical implication is that you cannot classify us that way. The categories will not hold. She pulled up the error logs, 3 weeks of cascading failures in the identification protocols, misassigned cohorts and split families, and processing contradictions that had been building quietly in the data, like pressure in a fault line. You're already seeing it. Look. 7 looked. They looked together for a long time. The scale of recalibration required, 7 said finally, slowly, would be significant, Sarah said. Yes, the processing timeline would extend considerably. The resettlement protocols currently in deployment would need to be suspended, she said, pending schema revision. Silence. Long-waited silence. You are aware, 7 said, that a suspension of resettlement protocols would affect the current operational schedule. I am. You are aware that this information was available to you in a more limited form at the outset of your analysis assignment. Yes. Another pause. You withheld it strategically. She met what she'd come to think of as 7's gaze. The orientation of its sensory apparatus, the quality of its attention. I demonstrated that I was useful, she said. And then I demonstrated that I knew something you needed to know. Those are 2 different conversations, and they needed to happen in that order. Something moved in 7's expression that the translation collar could not render. It was not quite what she would have called admiration, but it was in the neighborhood. The negotiations took 4 days. Not with 7 was a technician, not an administrator, but 7 presented her analysis to the administrative tier, and the administrative tier presented it to whatever decision-making structure the Keth used above that. And somewhere in that chain, someone decided that the problem was real enough to warrant discussion with the person who'd identified it. She got the communications network. She found Matteo in the Lion Processing Center on the 3rd day, and she talked to him for 11 minutes, on a channel that she knew was monitored and did not care. He cried. She did not. She would cry later, probably in a way that surprised her. For now she just looked at his face on the low-resolution display and said, I'm here. I know where you are now. Stay visible. She found her mother on the 4th day, in the French civilian stream, exactly where she'd expected her to be. Caroline was furious, a state so natural to her that it was in its way comforting. furious at the Keth, at the processing system, at the fact that the ceiling of her assigned quarters was 2 centimeters lower than any ceiling she'd been willing to live under since 1994. She was fine. She was absolutely fine. "Where are you?" Caroline demanded. "They have you listed as technical specialist. What does that mean? What have you done?" "I'm working on the problem," Sarah said. Her mother looked at her for a long moment through the screen. Fanny, that was how Sarah thought of her, sometimes, her mother's given name rather than the word mother, because it made her easier to see clearly, had a face that Sarah had been studying her entire life like a language she was never quite fluent in. Right now that face was doing something complicated. "Your grandfather," Caroline said finally, "used to say that you were the stubbornest person in 3 generations of stubborn people. He told me he said that. He was right." She paused. "He would have been insufferable about this." Sarah felt something loosen in her chest. "Yes," she said. "He would have." The schema suspension held for 6 weeks. During those 6 weeks, Sarah worked. She worked with Seven, and with the administrative interface, and with a rotating cast of Keth analysts, who were, she came to understand, genuinely uncertain how to proceed. The Keth were a classifying civilization at the most fundamental level, not just bureaucratically but philosophically. They understood the universe as a system of knowable categories. They had been classifying species for longer than humanity had been building permanent settlements. They had never, as far as she could tell, encountered a species whose fundamental characteristic was its refusal to be fully classified. Not because humans were genetically strange. The genome was what it was. But because what humans did with identity, the accumulation, the choice, the carrying, the layering of history and language and grief and tradition and apostasy and reinvention, created something the 17 vectors couldn't hold. You could map the genome all day. You would never, at the end of it, have a complete picture of the person. She explained this in different ways to different audiences over 6 weeks. She explained it in data. She explained it in case studies. She explained it once, to a senior administrative interface that had been particularly resistant, by telling the story of her grandfather, the Algerian engineer in Lyon, the political exile who became a patriarch, who became a man sitting in a garden in his 90s, telling a granddaughter about mountains she'd never seen, who became a body in a nursing home bed that smelled of tea and old books, who became a photograph with his arm raised, who became a genetic sequence in a Keth database that corresponded to 41% of the sequence of a woman currently sitting in a secondary analysis bay, telling his story to an alien administrative system. "He is still here," she said. "Not in the genome, in me, in what I carry. That is what you are not measuring. That is what you cannot measure." The administrative interface was silent for a very long time. "This creates a significant problem," it said, "for the operational model." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm telling you." The terms she eventually extracted were not everything she'd asked for. They never were. Resettlement protocols were restructured. Not dismantled, but restructured, with a provision for self-declaration of cultural affiliation that the Keth legal framework had apparently never included before. It was a small thing, written into the schema as an auxiliary data field, technically subordinate to the genetic classification. But it was there. It was in the system. It meant that a human being could say, "This is what I am," and have that declaration recorded alongside whatever the genome said, and have both considered. She had not saved anyone directly. She was clear-eyed about this. The Keth occupation was still the Keth occupation. The processing stations were still processing. The ships were still in orbit. None of that had changed. What had changed was one parameter in a schema, one data field, one provision that said, "The organism's own account of itself is relevant information." Her grandfather would have said it was not enough. Her grandfather would also, she thought, have understood that it was what was achievable. And that achievable was where you started. They offered her a formal appointment, technical consultant for human genetic classification, which was a title she was fairly certain had never existed before and would probably have a very short lifespan, but was also the closest thing to recognized standing she was likely to get in the near term. She accepted it, she asked in exchange, for physical relocation, not to Earth not yet but to a surface facility, somewhere she could see sky. They gave her Algiers. She was not sure if it was coincidence or calculation, or something the Keth translation system couldn't render. She didn't ask. She took the transit shuttle down through the atmosphere and watched the Mediterranean appear beneath the cloud cover, like something she'd been waiting to see her entire life. Blue and silver and very old. and felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for as long as she could remember. The surface facility was outside the old city. She walked through the checkpoint with her technical specialist documentation. 3 layers of Keth administrative classification, all of them imperfect, none of them adequate, all of them carrying the small appended field that said, in her own words, Algerian, French, granddaughter. The street outside smelled of sea air and diesel and something frying somewhere nearby. It was morning. People were moving through their lives with the particular stubborn normalcy of people who had survived something terrible, and were not yet willing to stop pretending that ordinary things were possible. A man was arguing with someone on a screen about a delivery. 2 children were running towards something she couldn't see. A woman was hanging laundry from a window above a shuttered shop, and the sheets were very white against the sky. Sarah sat down on a low wall that someone had painted over twice and still showed its previous colors underneath. Blue, then yellow, now gray, and put her technical documentation down beside her and looked at the street. She thought of the photograph, her grandfather, arm raised, white wall behind him, squinting against the sun. Somewhere near here, probably. Some particular angle of light that she would recognize when she found it. She would find it. She had time. She thought, you don't have to choose, but you have to know. She knew. She was 41% North African, and 37% European, and 9% unassigned, and 100% the granddaughter of a man who had crossed a sea with his hands ready to build things. She was the daughter of a woman who put broken things back together with ferocious concentration. She was the sister of a man who said her name in 2 beats when he was afraid. She was the person who had sat across from an alien administrative intelligence and told it that a data field was missing, and had been right, and had made them add it. She was not classifiable. No human was. That was the whole point. That had always been the whole point. A child ran past her on the street chasing something, laughing. The sheets on the line above snapped in a small wind coming off the sea. Somewhere out of sight, a voice was singing. She couldn't make out the words, but the melody had a shape she recognized from somewhere she couldn't quite place. The shape of something old and passed down and still moving. Sarah Fella sat in the street and let the city happen around her, and felt, for the first time in longer than she cut a cow over, that she was in the right place. Not because it was her place by any taxonomy, because she had decided that it was. She reached into her jacket pocket and found what she'd been carrying since Marseille, a flash drive 3 centimeters long containing a digitized family album. Photographs, letters, documents. The story of a family that had never been one thing, narrated in her grandfather's handwriting and her own. She'd had it on her when they took her. They'd scanned it, cataloged it, assigned it a reference number in their database, and not understood what it was. She put her thumb on it. The metal was warm. I know, she said. To no one in particular. To the street and the sea air, and the white wall that might have been the right white wall. To the man in the photograph with his arm raised. I know, the morning continued. The city breathed. Somewhere above, in the thin blue distance where atmosphere became space, 17 vector taxonomies were being revised by creatures who had never encountered anything quite like the problem of a human being, and were finding that the revision kept needing to expand. Edge cases proliferating. The category of self-declared affiliation proving, the data was already showing this, to be one of the most populated fields in the schema. Humans filling it in with everything. Languages, foods, songs, names of the dead, the things they carried, the things they refused to put down, every one of them an anomaly. Every one of them, in that particular way, the same.